So I want to talk about race and discrimination, specifically some definitions of racism and why the term itself is actually kind of problematic. it well, let's start with the definition. The definition of racism is any attitude, belief, or behavior or institutional arrangement that tends to favor one racial group or one ethnic group over another, right? So that's kind of what we're working with. But if you look at that definition, you'll see right away that there are some um, serious potential problems with that, right? It covers a lot of different things. Attitudes and behaviors, for example, are not the same, and yet this definition covers both. So what happens then is that in our society, we'll have people engaging in conversations um, um, about racism. One person might mean racial discrimination, another person might mean racist ideology or racial prejudice, and because all the parties involved are using the same word, racism, but they're describing different things, then they end up talking past each other. So this is a real issue, and one of the reasons why a more precise language tends to be something that's favored by academics and scholars working in these fields. So sometimes it may seem like we're splitting hairs or that we're getting needlessly obsessed with minutia, but it's very, very important if we're going to have conversations about various topics that we are in agreement on what the words that are going to be used in that conversation actually represent. All right, so with that in mind, I'm going to propose 4 variations in racism, right? 4 different possible meanings, all of which could reasonably be described as racism. And then, of course, walk through each of those, and we can talk about why we would want to favor a particular kind of racism or variation of racism over another when focusing on sort of sociological analyses of racial inequality and racial discrimination. All right, so let's start with the attitudinal dimensions, the stuff that exists up inside a person's head. The first and probably the most common form of racism is what we call racial prejudice. Racial prejudice is a tendency to overgeneralize in some way, usually negatively, toward an entire group of people, right? So a person is in a racial category. We have a certain set of assumptions about the nature of that category. Therefore, all of the things that are true of the category, we assume then are true of the individual member of that category. This is an exercise that involves stereotyping and a number of other very interesting sort of social psychological processes. We see that there are I don't know if we see, but I will tell you that there are 3 elements to racial prejudice. The first is cognitive, right? And this this dimension or element of racial prejudice is organized around what we think about a group, right? Cognition, right? Cognitive, it sort of makes sense. So the cognitive element of racial prejudice involves the things that we think about a particular group of people. The affective element, A-F-F-E-C-T-I-V-E, affective, has to do with a person's dislike of a particular group, the biases and the negative attitudes that one has toward a particular group, and therefore presumably toward members of that group. Right? That's the importance of that. And then the final element is what we call the conative. That's C-O-N-A-T-I-V-E. The conative element of racial prejudice is sort of desire to behave negatively toward members of that group, right? What does this prejudice connote in terms of how I should conduct my behavior? Now, it doesn't mean that you engage in some kind of discriminatory behavior. It just means that you feel like that behavior is warranted, that it's appropriate given what you think and what you feel about those groups. So when we look at racial prejudice and we kind of unpack it a little bit, we see that all of these elements are kind of working to formulate both our understandings of and our intentions toward members of these various groups. Now, racial prejudice is learned. It's learned from the culture. It's learned from agents of socialization like our family. It's embedded in other cultural forms like media and entertainment. Even sometimes very, very subtly, there are ways in which we are encouraged to be prejudiced that kind of grow out of long-standing social and cultural practices. We talked last time about sort of the history of racial prejudice and racial categories in the United States. And to sustain a system of racial caste, which is what we were creating in the United States around about the early 1700s, all the way up to and through the era of the Civil War, right? Building that system of racial caste, of chattel slavery that was based on racial classification requires an ongoing and persistent dehumanization of the people to whom you're going to behave this way. And that means in the culture there are sort of deep-seated, long-standing racial prejudices that often don't even get questioned anymore because they become part of the broad general socialization that occurs in a given society. So this is something that, as I said, I think is very, very common. I think most people, and I don't mean most white people, I mean most people, irrespective of race and ethnicity, most people harbor racial prejudice of some sort, right? Some more than others, and some more conscious and well within their scope of awareness. For other people, much more unconscious and perhaps unintended, but nevertheless still very, very prevalent. Now, whether people act on that racial prejudice or not is a different question, but I do think that there's a tremendous amount of evidence that suggests that racial prejudice is fairly well established and fairly widespread. So that's the first of the two attitudinal dimensions. The other attitudinal variation of racism is what we call racist ideology. Now, racist ideology is a belief that one race is superior to another. The superiority could be biological, it could be intellectual, it could be cultural, temperamental, moral, right? Lots of different ways in which one group might believe they are superior to another group. But the idea here is that, again, you're justifying a system of inequality, and you're legitimizing it in a way that allows it to be perpetuated, to be reproduced, to be done again and again and again. So white supremacy in the United States is a very good example of a racist ideology that was very explicitly cultivated so that whites and blacks could be sort of divided in concrete, meaningful, and consequential fashion, so that we could build a system of race-based chattel slavery in the early part of the 18th century. You can't do that. You can't systematically enslave, torture, kill, exploit, sell off other human beings unless you develop some sense of superiority to them, a way of sort of saying, in essence, that these are not really people, not like these others over here. And the primary driver of the distinction, the categorization, is going to be skin color, right? So white supremacy evolves as our understandings of race are being generated. Again, all in service of creating, a system of bonded labor, and the ability to then exploit that to generate profit for the planter class and for the colonies more broadly. So ideologies are really interesting, right? Ideologies exist to justify existing systems or practices, and in this case, the existing practice or system is again this system of race-based chattel slavery. It becomes institutionalized, right, built into the structures of society. So education or the economy or religion or family or, pick your social institution, right? The minute these ideologies begin to sort of firm up and manifest and take form, that's what we mean by formalized or institutionalized, right? It sort of takes shape. Once that begins to happen, then you're going to end up with widespread general acceptance of that ideology within the culture, and we see that the grip of white supremacy as a cultural ideology really doesn't start to relax until the second half of the 20th century, right? We see as the civil rights movement begins to make significant progress, as a whole historical set of contextual factors. I'm trying to sort of mentally prioritize maybe just a couple of them. But for example, immigration into the United States kind of slows down to almost a trickle, relatively speaking, in 1924 with the Reed-Johnson Immigration Control Act. So in 1924, we basically stop mass immigration into the United States. It doesn't go away completely, but it's a very, very small flow, as I said. And the proportions of immigration into the United States are a function in many respects of the relative size of the groups as they already exist in the U.S. And at the time that this happens, most of the immigration into the United States is coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, right? So we get the Slavs and the Poles coming in at the end of the 1800s. You get the wave of Italian immigration in say, the first decade or so of the 1900s. By 1924, it stops. And for a decent period of time there, for about 40 years, that's sort of the status quo. And then in 1965, right, we begin to liberalize our immigration laws again, and we open up the doors to increased immigration into the United States. But now it's coming from places like South Asia, Southeast Asia, parts of the Middle East, Central and South America, right? So suddenly the racial diversity of the United States is expanding dramatically. The ethnic diversity of the United States is expanding dramatically, and in response, part of the response to that is an increasing embrace of a sort of multicultural ideology and multicultural education, in which the value of diversity for its own sake begins to get sort of shared. That ideology of multiculturalism begins to erode the dominant ideology that was in place before, which was white supremacy. Now, that's not to say that white supremacy has gone away, but rather that its dominance as a functional ideology to help organize racial and ethnic categories and the consequences of being in racial and ethnic categories, that kind of starts to go away, right? And so we can look at some very significant and real progress that's happened with regard to race in the United States over the second half of the last third or so of the 20th century, and of course continuing into the 21st. So again, an ideology, not quite the same thing as racial prejudice. Both of these things are things that exist inside a person's mind, so we would call these attitudinal elements or attitudinal variations of racism. But people will use the word racism to describe prejudice. They'll also use the word racism to describe racist ideology. And if the two parties who are having a conversation and using the word racism aren't talking about the same kind of racism, you can see where that leads to misunderstandings and less productive communication than if there was a clear understanding of what we mean when we talk about or when we use the word racism. So instead of using racism, it's better to say racial prejudice or racist ideology, because those are not the same thing. So on the On the behavioral side of this sort of matrix, this little sort of 2x2 table, we have discrimination. And discrimination exists at both the individual level and at the institutional level, right? So this is another place in which, people using the word racism to describe the discriminatory behaviors of an individual person could be talking to somebody who is describing racism as a set of institutional and structural arrangements. And because the two parties are just using the word racism, again, they're going to talk past each other. So again, the precision in language is the importance of the precision of language is constantly underscored in these kinds of conversations in which we aren't as productive as we could be if we were just in agreement on what it was we were talking about. So discrimination is a behavior, right? It's different than an attitude, which is a thing that exists in a person's head. Individual discrimination or individual race-based discrimination, if you want to be very precise, because there is also, of course, individual sex-based discrimination, there's individual gender-based discrimination, there's individual age-based or ability-based or sexuality-based discrimination. So we're going to say individual discrimination, but even that is not as precise as it should be. I should probably make the effort to say individual race-based discrimination, which is a lot, and you can see why somebody would favor just saying racism. But again, sometimes the more precise thing is a little bit extra work, but worth it if it allows us to have a productive conversation. So when we talk about individual race-based discrimination, we're talking about behavior by individuals. And the behavior by individuals specifically is going to lead to unequal treatment on the basis of race or ethnicity or some other descriptive status, right? Some status that is imposed upon a person, not something within their control. This is when most people, I suspect, in the United States, when they think of racism, this is probably what they have in mind. An individual person engaging in some kind of discriminatory practice. I'm not going to hire you for a job. I'm going to single you out for, verbal attacks using racial slurs, right? That's the kind of thing we think of, I think, when we think about individual discrimination, or I should say racism, which is in the minds of most people, I think, individual discrimination. Institutional discrimination, or institutional race-based discrimination, or institutional racism, it can be called a lot of different things, but again, if we want to be precise, we would say institutional race-based discrimination is a set of arrangements or practices within social institutions or related organizations, right, elements of the social structure that favor one racial or ethnic group over another. Now, institutional race-based discrimination can come in two different forms. It can be intentional, things like residential or school segregation, prior to the civil rights movement, right? You could require by law that blacks, for example, in Chicago, live in certain racially restricted communities, neighborhoods. That was institutional in the sense that it was happening in the law, and it was discriminatory, right? That you were treating this group of people differently than you were treating another group of people by law. Jim Crow laws are a really good example of intentional race-based discrimination. The syphilis experiments conducted on African Americans at Tuskegee, again, a really good example of intentional institutional discrimination. The other is what we call unintentional, or maybe subtle. You could go either way. Also race-based institutional discrimination, but something that might be sort of built into the legacy of previous practices, or race-neutral language that still produces racially disparate and discriminatory outcomes. That's what we mean when we talk about unintentional institutional race-based discrimination. So here would be things like how we fund public education, right? K through 12 public education in the United States is funded by property taxes, the overwhelming majority of it anyway. There are some federal contributions and state contributions, but most of the funding for K through 12 education is local, and it's a function of property taxes, right? It's a function of the relative affluence of the community in which people live. More affluent communities in which properties are valued higher will have a larger base of taxable, assets out there, a more valuable set of taxable assets out there. They could then use to generate a lot of money to fund local schools. Poor neighborhoods where property values are very low will have less of those resources. So when you look at that set of practices, there's nothing in there about race. Now, setting aside for a moment that people seem to be apparently perfectly okay with saying that poor neighborhoods deserve crappy schools, and therefore the kids in those neighborhoods deserve to go to underfunded schools. I mean, that's kind of messed up. But let's put that aside for a moment and just look at the racial element. You could look at the laws that govern how we fund K through 12 public education with our tax dollars, and you won't find any mention of race. It is race neutral in its language, but it is definitely not race neutral in its effect, right? Because we know that African Americans or other people of color are overrepresented among the poor. And what that means, of course, is that if you're a person of color, a child of color, you are much more likely to be going to an underfunded public school than if you're white. And that is discrimination, right? It's hidden. You can't really point to the law and say, see, here's where the law intends to create sort of different educational outcomes for black kids and white kids, or poor kids and wealthy kids. You can see that a little more clearly. What you can't see is the racial dimension unless you're able to link those two things up together, right? When you look at inequality and you see the way in which inequality is sort of organized around and structured around race, then it's easy to see the way in which a policy that is aimed at affluent people, or a policy that's aimed at poor people, is going to be more likely to impact white people or people of color. So this is what we talk about when we talk about structural inequality or institutional race-based discrimination or institutional racism. So it's a really, really complicated sort of racism to kind of unravel, because it requires people to be able to see the way in which various social factors are kind of intersecting and operating simultaneously. You need to have at least a little bit of a grasp of history, some overriding sense of demographics and things like that. And it's harder for people, I think, to see institutional discrimination, which is why that's where most of the discriminatory behavior still sort of lives in American society, right? Most of the individual discrimination, we've kind of tamped that down. It's not gone, don't get me wrong. I don't want to suggest that. But individual acts of discrimination are a lot less prevalent in 2022, for example, than in 1922, right? 100 years makes a tremendous amount of difference, it turns out. Institutionally, though, it's hard to say, right? I think the overt institutional race-based discrimination is certainly diminished, right? We don't have Jim Crow laws on the books anymore. That isn't necessarily a sign that we've completely eradicated Jim Crow, and we certainly haven't eradicated the effects of it. But if we go looking for places where discrimination is still sort of alive and well in American society, it is at the level of institutions, more so than it is at the level of individuals. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Now, one last thing I want to talk about, which is the relationship between attitudes and behaviors, right? We've got racial prejudice and racist ideology on the attitudinal side of this. We've got individual race-based discrimination and institutional race-based discrimination on the behavioral side of this. And I want to point out that there are some assumptions that people make, which is that discriminatory behavior has to come from a place of racist attitudes, whether we're talking about prejudice or racist ideologies, that you can't really have discrimination without discriminatory intent. And I think that speaks um, pretty significantly to America's tendency to psychologize a lot of what happens in society. But here's the thing: you can get a discriminatory outcome even if the parties involved in putting policies or laws or other kinds of things into action don't themselves have racist intent. Again, how we fund K through 12 education in the United States creates a racially discriminatory outcome, but the people who put those policies into place, right, the lawmakers of the state of Illinois, the state revenue agencies, the people who cut the checks to the school districts, none of those people, in all likelihood, maybe some of them, but most of them probably don't do this with a sense that, we're going to create some advantages for whites and some disadvantages for non-whites, right? So no prevalence of racist attitudes is actually creating this outcome. It's a set of policies and laws that are in place that are doing that work for them. So you can have discriminatory outcomes even in the absence of racist intent, because attitudes don't always determine behaviors. A person could have racist ideologies in their mind or harbor racial prejudice and never act on them, right? So the attitude is present, but the behavior does not indicate or betray that. You can have instances where a person engages in a discriminatory practice, but it isn't for, again, underlying attitude, racial or racist attitudes. A really great example might be a guy who runs a lunch counter in Selma, Alabama in 1950, right? Before the Civil Rights Act, before, we get this massive civil rights movement that starts to make these things, starts to challenge and change these things. So here you've got a guy who runs a lunch counter. African-American customer comes in, wants to eat some lunch, is told to leave. Now, he could be asked to leave because the owner of the restaurant is a racist in the sort of broadly understood sense of the word. He has racist ideology in his head, or he's harboring some deep prejudices against people of color, and now he is acting on them by discriminating against this black person in a way that he does not toward his white customers, right? So that would be sort of, I think, how most people would understand how racism works. But the owner could just simply be following the law, right? The owner may not have any problem with people of color, right? On a personal level, on an individual level, in terms of his attitudes. He may think that the laws that he is following are in fact unjust. That doesn't mean he can't sort of just choose not to follow them. He could lose his business. He could end up being a pariah in his community. There are all kinds of incentives for him to still adhere to the law and to engage in a pattern of discrimination against black customers, even though he himself doesn't harbor any ill will toward them. So here's the kicker. For the person being kicked out of the restaurant, does it feel any different? Right? I don't think so, right? I don't think that has a meaningful distinction for the person experiencing discrimination. So sociologists, I think, are in a relatively fortunate position. We don't spend a lot of time obsessing about intentions or motivation or attitudes. We try to measure them. We try to sort of see if we can gather some information. But because we're talking about something that exists inside a person's head, that's kind of outside of our ability to kind of independently, empirically verify. So we don't have a way of directly measuring that. What we can measure, of course, what we can document and observe and record are behaviors. And as an added bonus, behaviors are the things that matter anyway, right? So at the end of the day, the thing that is important is not where the underlying discriminatory practice is coming from at the individual level. It's that it is happening, right? And that is the thing that we kind of focus on. We focus on the things that happen rather than trying to unravel the reasons why. I mean, again, at the structural level, we're very much about sort of getting behind the scenes and understanding how processes, right, how a particular set of social and structural conditions creates a particular outcome. But at the individual level, trying to understand individual discrimination at the end of the day isn't really a thing that sociology is going to obsess about. They're going to focus on the consequences of discrimination, the degree to which the law might, for example, facilitate or ease the practice of discrimination versus place barriers in its way. Right, that is something that sociology can observe and measure and document, and thus becomes very, very helpful. All right, so hopefully that clears up the need for kind of precise language when it comes to talking about things like racism. We want to be clear that we are all on the same page when we use that word. So maybe the way to get around that, of course, is to not use that word, but rather to use more precise language like institutional race-based discrimination or racial prejudice or racist ideology. Or even just cut to the chase, right, and say white supremacy, right? If that's ultimately what we're talking about. So, for example, in the United States, that would probably be the most prevalent form of racist ideology still in the United States. If that's what we're talking about, that's what we should call it. I know that makes people uncomfortable, but again, right, discrimination is not an easy subject. It's something that's embarrassing to people who benefit from it, especially when they themselves don't feel or harbor any of those attitudes. Nevertheless, it's a thing that has to be resisted. It's a thing that has to be countered, because the consequence of tolerating it in our society is that people's lives are materially impacted in a very negative way. So next time we'll talk a little bit about some of the consequences of this, specifically ethnic and racial stratification. I promise that one will be a little bit shorter than this one. So until then, I'll say take care.